All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you might happen to be out in the world. Appreciate you being able to take time out of your day today to join us here for this conversation. Real quick introduction. So myself, my name is Joe Adamski. I'm a senior director with Procurability. We are a procurement and supply chain focused consulting firm. Happy to have any conversations with you might want to have about that after. You want to find me on LinkedIn. I have been in strategy and procurement consulting for 15 years. Prior to that, I was in the Air Force and as a cog in the supply chain because I was a pilot flying cargo and transport. So I've lived supply chain my entire adult life. With me today is Daniel Stanton, known as Mr. Supply Chain. He's a distinguished author, educator, and speaker in supply chain management and project management. He's a graduate of MIT and a Navy veteran. I won't hold that against you. Daniel is author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies and is renowned for his expertise and has been featured in media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal and CNBC. He's a lecturer at the University of Arkansas and a prominent LinkedIn learning instructor, and his teachings have reached over 2.5 million learners globally. So happy to have the opportunity to talk with you here today, Dan.
Joe, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it, and I love having this kind of conversation. So thank you.
Wonderful. So what we're here to talk about today, and what maybe brought everyone's attention, is we're talking about natural disasters and the challenges that it brings to supply chains. If you were coming out of hurricane season, thankfully, obviously there was a late storm that looked like it was still going to be an issue come today that fortunately has petered out in the Caribbean.
And it was an early season too.
We did have an early season. It did start late. Myself, I am currently working in Puerto Rico, and I will say for us, it was a very light season, knock on wood, because we got brushed by one tropical storm, and we had one other that came across the island, but we didn't take a direct hit from anything this year. So that's wonderful for us down here. But that's maybe the question. So how, as we start with that, we think about some of these natural disasters that happen, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, fires. How do those kinds of things impact supply chains? And what are the challenges that you've seen or that you've experienced talking with other people that arise during those events?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. It's funny. So you mentioned hurricane season. You're in Puerto Rico, and this year was a light season for hurricanes there. I'm in North Carolina. And, we got, hit at the end of September, early October. This devastating hurricane in Asheville, of all places, which is really, seen as sort of a climate refuge, a place that people were going to get away from weather effects and climate change. So, when thinking about natural disasters in terms of risk profiles for supply chains, I think, a good place to start it is by looking at two sets of data. One is, what are the geographies that you're talking about, right? And when we look at a supply chain, sometimes we start with the facilities, right? Where are, maybe retail stores, where distribution centers, where factories, but we also have to think about all the logistics infrastructure in between, highways, railroads, ports. So identifying the locations that we need to consider really through supply chain mapping is an important step. And then the other one is, for each of those locations, identifying, well, what are the risks? What are the threats? And 2 months ago, we would not have thought about hurricanes as a major threat in Asheville, North Carolina, but we certainly would have, anytime we're looking at things in Puerto Rico. So the interesting thing that highlights about the threat profiles is, we tend to build that threat profile based on what's happened in the past, but new things happen, and those risks change over time as we gather new information. So, likewise, the supply chain footprint changes over time, right? The locations, the ports that we're using. So for me, when we talk about doing supply chain risk management and preparing for natural disasters, it's an ongoing process, right? We need to be dynamically updating both our understanding of the network and our understanding of the risks and threats in order to have some level of confidence that we understand what our exposure is.
Absolutely. And where have you seen examples of companies that have done this well?
It's funny you asked that. I was part of a team at Caterpillar 10 years ago that created one of the very first supply chain control towers. We called it the Assurance of Supply Center. Was an amazing learning journey for me personally and professionally, was an incredibly powerful tool for the company, because it did allow us to sort of in one place in this control tower see what that network looked like, identify when things were happening in the network, and sort of like draw a polygon around the affected area, and then zoom into whether it was suppliers, whether it was facilities, whether it was ports, and make sure that we understood what was actually how that was impacting our supply chain in near real time. Since then, so we were doing that at a time when I'll say we were putting it together with duct tape and baling wire because nobody had ever built anything quite like that before. These days, I know that there are companies that are actually building control tower, command center sorts of software. It's a category now that Gartner monitors. It's an area that a lot of consultants have developed expertise in to go in and help companies figure out how to do it quickly and efficiently and not have to learn a lot of those painful lessons the hard way.
Yeah. So you're talking about defining some of the issues that were happening at that point of impact. So something is broken, identifying what it is, you got to go in and fix it. That's certainly one adjustment that has to happen. And that's, the events have occurred, you're trying to react to those. But if we pull back from that a little bit, you think about it from a planning perspective. What are the things to take into account for that? If you're looking at these natural disasters, and I describe them as planned, unplanned events. I'm watching the list of folks as they're popping up. There's plenty of us that are in hurricane prone areas because we're in the southeast of the United States, and we know from late summer into around about now that we have issues with major storms that are coming through. If you're in the northern tier of the United States, the Northwest just got hit with a nasty winter storm. But come wintertime, blizzards are a very real possibility. So you got to plan around those. If you're out west, you have to worry about wildfires, or even California, probably earthquakes is the one that they need to potentially plan for. But knowing that those things are coming, knowing that that's in the cards for you, how do you then take that information and figure out what do we need to plan around for that?
Right. That's the really important question, right? Is what do we do about it? And what can we do? And because we can't do an infinite amount of preparation because it costs money, right? And we still, the risk is an element of business. One of the most useful tools to start on that journey is to create a risk scorecard, where literally you just identify, well, what are the risks that we think are in the cards for this location, this facility, this part of our supply chain. And then for every risk, assign, first of all, a probability. How likely do you think it is that planned, unplanned event is going to occur? And then second, make some sort of an assessment of the impact. If that happened, how bad would it be? How much would it affect us? And once you have that probability and the impact, you can just multiply those two numbers together and come up with sort of a risk score. And then you can rank all of your risks based on the product of probability and impact. That's a really imperfect way of building a supply chain risk management strategy, but it's a good place to start. Because things that have a really high risk score obviously are ones that you have to take seriously, right? It's highly likely that it's going to occur. The effects would be really radical. What are we going to do about that? It turns out, the what are you going to do about it? In risk management terms, we talk about that as the risk treatment. And it turns out there are really only 4 options for a risk treatment. You can accept the risk. You can avoid the risk, do something to change it so that doesn't affect you anymore. You can transfer the risk in many cases. That could be writing a contract that makes somebody else responsible for it. Could be buying an insurance policy so that the insurance company accepts the risk. And your fourth option is to do something about it, to mitigate the risk, to take some kind of an action that's either going to reduce the probability or the impact or both. But once you've identified the risks, you've ranked the severity, and you've gone through that exercise of choosing a risk treatment, you really begin to feel like I don't want to say you've got control over everything, but at least you're able to manage the risk.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really huge deal. The one thing that I'll throw in though, I've seen a lot of companies use kind of the 80-20 rule with doing their risk treatment and say, okay, we're going to take the top 20% of risks based on risk score, and we're going to invest the time and money to fix that, and we're just going to accept the other 80%, right? The 80% of the risks, because that's probably only 20% of the actual potential impact on the business.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's those risks that are buried deeper down on the list that bite and that hurt. There were some really good examples. A couple of years ago, Ford Motor Company had a supplier of magnesium parts. It was, if you would have built that risk score, this one supplier for this one category of parts would not have shown up as a high probability or a high impact. But that supplier's plant had a fire, and it turned out that Ford was using magnesium parts from that supplier in almost everything they made. They didn't have other sources of supply, and they didn't have a lot of inventory because they were running lean. And so while the risk scorecard does let you see which are the risks that you just absolutely have to deal with right away, I always caution people, don't ignore the rest of them. They all matter, and you need to make sure that you've got a handle, and either you're accepting the risk, avoiding it, transferring it, or mitigating it.
Yeah. Well, I've worked with utilities working down here in Puerto Rico, but also worked with utilities in Florida. And the view that most take is to say, well, what are the storms that are going to come through? And there's a handy scale for those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They'll plan for a Cat 2. They will look at it from the standpoint of, how much stuff do we need to lay in to be able to weather a Cat 2 storm? What is the anticipated damages that come through from that? What are the types of things that we expect to be impacted, and what do we need to bring in? But you may have, the reality is you may get a worse storm than what you could potentially plan for. And then you have that secondary layer of planning that comes in for that. Some of it may even be infrastructure related, looking at it from a standpoint of what have you built your system to be able to withstand? You want it to be overbuilt. We down here are now buying poles that are resistant for Cat 5 winds. They'll withstand 165 mile an hour winds. Will we get that coming through? I hope not. But, you got to plan around that. It could potentially be the case.
It's a great point, Joe. One of the things that we see time and time again, kind of ironically, but the places that get hit the most frequently often become more resilient over time. For exactly, exactly that reason. It's like, once you've been burnt or, in this case, flooded, then the risk is more real. So when you go back to rebuild that infrastructure, we do tend to make it more resilient. And also we get better at the recovery piece of it, right? When you have a chance to practice everything that it takes to rebuild after a disaster, well, there's a learning curve, and sort of as a community and as an industry, we figure out how to do that well. So, we see that in places like Florida, where, we nowadays frequent issues with hurricanes.
Right.
The damage can be really severe. And at the same time, it seems like they've got, I'll use the term infrastructure, but capabilities in place to respond and rebuild and oftentimes come back better than they were before.
Yeah. You know ahead of time what kinds of restoration services you need to have available, and you can set up the supply chain for those ahead of time. It's always the tension in supply chain between resiliency and efficiency. And I would say pre-COVID, we all way over-indexed on the efficiency side. And that that we're still dealing with the aftermath of that. I would say, even still today.
For sure.
But focusing on that resilient side of the tent and that kind of push pull, how do you see companies being good about building resilient supply chains?
Well, it's the perfect segue, because the thing that I was thinking about is, we often think about a supply chain as being, I'll call it fragile or resilient. And there's kind of a scale there, right? And resiliency means you've got redundancy, you've got adaptability, right? You can change when you need to. But actually the scale goes beyond resilient, because there are actually supply chains that are anti-fragile, meaning there are supply chains that perform better, that are able to capture market share, that are able to excel when there is a disaster. And a story that I heard and can share about that is a company that made generators that was able to, look at a forecast, see a big storm coming in, look at the inventory of generators available in retail outlets, and then pre-position inventory, not necessarily in the stores where the storm was going to hit, but just outside the boundary, so that, when the storm had passed through and you were able to start moving things in, they could get their generators in immediately. And because of that capability, they had 100% of the market share, right, in those early days. So that's an example of an anti-fragile supply chain, right? Doesn't make sense in every situation, right? Sometimes it's okay to accept fragile and just recognize, hey, if something happens, my supply chain is going to go down. Sometimes you say, no, this is really important. We need to keep, our supply chain running, because our customers depend on us, our shareholders depend on us running the business. And sometimes you say, actually, we want to be positioned so that we can take advantage of the opportunity provided by a natural disaster.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about some companies that have done well with being able to plan around disasters and establish their supply chains. But what are some of the common mistakes or pitfalls that companies have in terms of planning their supply chains around risks?
Yeah. The mistake that I see most often is folks that invest the time and the money to build a plan. They go through the exercise of mapping the supply chain, developing risk scorecards, thinking through risk treatments and mitigations. And then they take that and they put it on a binder and they set it on the shelf, and then go back to their daily business of trying to make the everything run efficiently. And that's a problem for a bunch of reasons. One, if it just sits on the shelf, over time, people forget that the shelf is even there, right?
Right.
But like we were talking about earlier, part of what makes us resilient is having experience in responding to disruptions. You can get that when there's an actual disruption, or you can get that from some kind of an exercise, right? A tabletop exercise or drills. I'm sure when you were in school like me, a couple times a year, you got to do a fire drill, right? Why do we do that? Because in the event that there's actually a fire, having gone through that process of going down the stairs, walking outside, knowing where you need to muster, means that everybody's going to be able to play their part and minimize the disruption, the risk. So, the first problem with putting it on the shelf is people don't know that it's there, don't actually know what they're supposed to do, right? Because they don't understand the role. The second problem with putting it on the shelf goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, is that the supply chain changes and the risks change. And so, a plan that you put together, literally imagine a plan that we'd put together in November of 2019. How useful would that be in March of 2020 because of COVID, right? The locations are all different. Everybody's working from home. The risks are all different. So the mistake that we need to avoid is creating a risk management plan and having it become stale. And the way to fix that is by having a process where we're going in and routinely practicing what's in there and updating it, making sure that it's fresh and current and useful information.
Yeah, I think that's what's important, is having those planning cycles available and something that you actually exercise. Right, no one would have planned for a pandemic, just flat out. We hadn't had one for 100 years. It's just not, at least not on any kind of a significant scale. Obviously, certain parts of the world have certainly had localized events that had occurred, but you wouldn't have expected that. No one quite knew how to react to it. I mean, some companies did well. They had robust systems in place. They had things they could exercise, but those dried up over time. But it's also one of those of, you just can't plan for every event that's out there. I don't know who would have expected a tanker, or excuse me, a cargo ship to jackknife in the Suez Canal. Right? You don't plan for that. The Panama Canal drying out because it doesn't get enough rain in the rainforest. You don't plan around that. It's something that comes up, and if you don't have that ability to go back and revisit and say, okay, well, this was not an anticipated impact, but we have a process, we have a way to be able to address this, we have something that we can do. Without that, you're just going to be, well, kind of left high and dry. So we do have a question that's popped
Agreed.
up.
Yeah.
So looking for recent response to a natural disaster from someone that served as a model for future responses for how things can go right. I can talk from personal experience on that. About 2 years ago, a hurricane that moved through Florida. We were doing some work trying to redesign the supply chain to help with a utility, trying to help them to get in front of some of the disruptions that COVID had caused. Everything interconnects, right? But the hurricane came through. And so what that ended up being, then they had a cycle, they had a plan, they had a way to be able to address it, but it turns into all hands on deck. So for me, from our perspective, we stopped our work. We were no longer there as consultants. We were no longer there to help to try to redesign the supply chain and build fancy models and do all of that. No, we just became staff augmentation for them at that point. And we turned around to help them to be able to make the phone calls they needed to, make the contracts they needed to, the coordination that needed to happen to get the things that they needed in order to be able to backfill their gaps. Now, their process had been, because these storms are coming, this event is going to happen, you have at least 48 hours of warning, usually longer. You mentioned parking things outside of the zone. Well, there were fleets of trucks sitting in Georgia and Alabama waiting to come into Florida. Once the storm passes through, those trucks start rolling, and they're bringing in utility crews, they're bringing in food, they're bringing in water. There are nonprofits out there that will roll in massive trucks that are mobile kitchens so they can feed thousands of people. There's some that bring in mobile showers, laundry facilities, things like that are necessary so that you get into the disaster and you make sure that you're taking care of people's needs. It goes back to that Maslow's hierarchy, right? You got to make sure you're taking care of the basics first. People have food, they have some place to stay that's warm and dry, they have water. Take care of those things, then everything else can be layered on later. But you got to make sure that the people are taken care of first, and that's certainly what I saw in terms of that response, which was to a Cat 2 storm.
I couldn't agree with that more. It's a great example, and one of the things, Joe, that I will mention for companies thinking about their own supply chain risk management and disaster response, if you've got a facility in an area like, we'll say Florida, and a hurricane comes through and damages the facility, it is, a natural thing to say that, okay, well, it's my people in that facility that are going to be responsible for, rebuilding, assessing the damage, all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if they live there, there's also a really good chance that they've been impacted personally by the storm, that their family has been impacted. And so for companies that have the scale to do it, one of the really smart things that you can do is to say, hey, if this facility is, in the path of a severe storm, maybe we bring in folks from some other facility to help with that recovery effort, so that the folks that live there, the permanent staff of that facility, can take care of the basic needs of themselves, their homes, their families. Mm-hmm. I've seen that, it doesn't necessarily work for small organizations, but for big organizations that have facilities in different locations and can can tap into those resources, that can be not only a really powerful way of building back quickly, but there's some sort of intangible benefits that come from that. One, the relationship that you build with your team that was in the affected area, right? Because they now see that the lengths that you as a company went through to make sure they could take care of themselves and their family, and you handled the business. The other thing that I've actually seen happen from that's a really interesting unintended consequence is bringing in people from other facilities to help with the recovery is actually an opportunity for knowledge transfer and relationship building throughout the company. And so there can be sort of some long-term benefits that come from that because of improvements that either folks from outside are able to bring, or because of things that those folks from the outside learn while they're there that they can then take home.
Right. It's a natural opportunity to break some silos that you wouldn't get otherwise. Absolutely. So as we kind of turn towards the end here, as I'm cognizant of the time, I want to talk a little bit about the future. So what are some of the emerging trends, technologies, tools, processes, ways of working that you're seeing that companies can use to approach a better risk management in their supply chains?
Yeah, I mean, this is a space that has changed so much in the last 10 years. There are now lots of software tools on the market targeting supply chain risk management. Some of those tools focus on what I'd call building a digital twin of the supply chain, mapping it out, modeling it, and then in many cases, sort of having, I'll call it sensors or real-time data that ties into that digital twin so that you can see what's happening and get alerts automatically if there's a potential disruption. So the availability of that off-the-shelf software it is a huge deal. The other thing that's interesting about that, I'll just mention, a lot of companies that I've talked with that as they implement supply chain risk management, they do find other business benefits. They find because it tells them so much about their supply chain, they can often make smarter decisions about modes of transportation, where to place, things. If things aren't working the way they're supposed to because there's a delay or a diversion, having that supply chain risk management system in place just provides such rich information that transforms your ability to manage the supply chain. So that for me is really, I guess, the two big trends. One you mentioned earlier, during COVID, all of a sudden everybody started talking about supply chains and supply chain risk management and understanding that resilience was important. And then the second is we have lots of tools. We have a lot more people that understand how to do this and do it well. And frankly, I think companies are really catching on and starting to put effort and investment and allocate resources to do it and do it well because they understand the potential impacts as far up as the C-suite.
Yeah. And I think those are the ones that recognize that are the ones that are going to win. It's if you can be proactive instead of reactive, that's always going to put you in a better position overall. All right.
100%. It's planned, unplanned events that you need to be ready for.
Absolutely. So as we're kind of coming up on the end of time here, is there any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience here today?
I guess the one thing that we haven't talked about that I think is really important for supply chain risk management is scenario planning, right? And so, we can make the list of risks, but it's really useful to think about, okay, let's create a scenario. Let's say a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, right? How does that scenario affect our supply chain, right? And to work through, because supply chains are really, we call them supply chains, right? It's a terrible name for it because it's not about supply. It's about supply and demand. And fundamentally, it's about creating value for a customer. And it's not a chain, it's a network, right? And so we really need to think more broadly about it. And when we do scenario planning, we can start to think about how an event could lead to a chain reaction, a series of events, problems that could affect our supply chain in multiple ways, and then work through, are those risks that we're willing to accept? Are those risks that we can somehow transfer? Are those risks that we can avoid somehow, or are those risks that we want to mitigate? And how are we going to do that? So scenario planning, I think, is 100% one of the most useful tools in that space. And I talk through in Supply Chain Management for Dummies, really how to do scenario planning for supply chain risk management.
Yeah. I actually, when we found out we were going to be doing this conversation, I went ahead and bought your book and read it in the weekend. So I do remember that section. But you're right. I mean, when you have something happen, you need to ask the questions. When the cargo ship hit the bridge in Baltimore, seems we've had a lot of shipping incidents lately, but when it hit there,
we haven't even talked about the missiles in the Suez Canal. We
I left that one
given, but right.
But my first question to my team here was, okay, do we have anything coming out of Baltimore? The answer was no. Like, great. Now go talk to our major suppliers and find out if they have anything that's stuck in Baltimore that's now going to impact the stuff that we were supposed to be buying from them, because they're going to start allocating their volume. You've got to figure that out as you come along through there. So, all right. So I see we're kind of here on the end of our allotted time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think this has been a great conversation. Looking to the future, the next supply chain discussion I'd like to invite everyone to is on December 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Our CEO from Procurability, Conrad Snover, will be having a conversation with Dr. Mudassir Ahmed on the concept of supply chain cost-saving strategies for 2025 and beyond. I see we did just have a question pop up that was asking that very question, so I appreciate the transition. It was a perfectly planned plug. But highly recommend that conversation, because it's going to be very focused on answering that question. And on the screen at the moment is a QR code if you would care to scan it. We'll let you subscribe to an Insights newsletter that we in Procurability publish on a regular basis, get you some insights on things that may be affecting your supply chain, that will give you some ability to get in front of those a little faster than some of your competitors. So, Dan, thank you very much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. This was a great conversation.
Awesome. Joe, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody, for joining.